A number of years ago, I saw a play that depicted the garden and Adam and Eve and their relationship with God in the beginning. And in the beginning, Adam and Eve, they dwelled with God and they listened to God speak to them and they shared their hearts with God as well. And God gave them a commandment. He said, do not eat of the fruit of this particular tree. And eventually, they disobeyed God. They gave in to sin. And after they sinned through their disobedience, God continued to communicate with them. But as communicating, we're no longer hear his voice. Do you see what just happened? You saw my lips moving. You knew I was communicating something, but you probably missed a few of the words. Hey, that's what happened with Adam and Eve in this play. God was still trying to communicate with them, but they weren't able to hear God speak with clarity as they once were because of their sin. The same happens to you and I. Whenever we live in a state of sin, we close ourselves off from being able to perceive God's voice with clarity. Jesus speaks to us in the gospel and the New Testament, in the Beatitudes. He says, blessed are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. Shall see God. If we're able to see God's face, then we're in a much better posture to hear God's voice. Whenever I was a kid, my mother used to always say to me, boy, you better look at me when I'm talking to you. Now, why did she care if I was looking at her or the television? Because she knew if I was not looking at her, I was not listening to her as well. If we cannot see God, then how are we going to hear God? If we cannot hear God, then how are we going to perceive the invitations of God, his proposals to us for us to become saints through our vocations? The word vocation comes from the Latin vocare, which means to call. To call. He's calling us, but many of us don't hear because we're in a state of sin. And so some of the practical tools that I offer people whenever they are trying to discern their vocation always begin with being in a state of grace, being in a relationship with God by going to the sacrament of reconciliation frequently so that we can be in a state of grace, have a pure heart. Because if we have a pure heart, then we can see God. If we can see God, then we can listen to God. So abide in a relationship with God, not only through the scriptures and through service, but through the sacraments, by being baptized, receiving Holy Communion frequently, receiving the sacrament of reconciliation frequently. But what else do we do to abide in this state of grace so that we could see God's face and ultimately hear God's voice so we could discern God's plan for us to become saints through vocations? I would also encourage us, if we are perceiving this invitation, if we're interested in learning more about the priesthood, to not only go to Mass, but to reach out to our pastor and say, hey, look, can I be an altar server at the holy sacrifice of the Mass? Get close to the action of the altar. As we worship God, get close to the priest who's leading us in worship of God at the holy sacrifice of the Mass. What else can we do? We can go on retreats, participate in missions, visit the seminaries through come and sees, reach out to the vocation director and say, I just want to go check out the seminary. And when you go to the seminary, just pay attention to your heart. Can I imagine myself in this place with these other men, learning about the gift of the priesthood, learning about the church's teachings, growing in my relationship with God through a rule of life, a plan of life that is conducive to me growing in holiness in this context, in this environment? Get a spiritual director. Right? Find a priest or a holy person to accompany you in the spiritual life. Not just like in counseling, but like in the spiritual life, focusing on God. And where is God at? And how do I perceive and receive God in my life? By having a consistent prayer life that my spiritual director can check in on me with, can hold me accountable to, can encourage me, can challenge me to grow in. Consistent time spent with God, set apart for prayer, for relationship. Relationship with God, relationship with Jesus Christ is what is most important. If we are in a relationship with Jesus Christ, the time that we spend with Jesus Christ in prayer, then we will be in a much better posture to perceive these invitations from God. And finally, pay attention to my imagination. Whenever I imagine myself as a priest celebrating Mass or hearing confessions or preparing someone for eternity through the sacrament of the anointing of the sick, by administering the last rites, by witnessing marriages, by accompanying people and families who are grieving in death, by serving God's people not only through my ministry to the poor, but through teaching and proclaiming the gospel, by sharing the message of Jesus Christ, by spending an adequate and sufficient amount of time every single day set apart for prayer. If this excites my heart when I imagine myself doing it, then pay attention to that and bring it to the Lord in prayer and bring it to your spiritual director. Abide with the Lord in Holy Communion. Whenever we do these things, we will place ourselves in a much better disposition. And then finally, reach out to the vocation director for the diocese. So the vocation director of the diocese, in this case for Baton Rouge, that's me, can walk with you. Can walk with you and invite the church to now discern this vocation that you perceive God might be inviting you to enter into, to respond to. But keep in mind this, you're free. You're free. Even if you perceive an invitation and the church affirms that invitation and you begin to go to seminary to discern that invitation, it's just that, an invitation. God's not going to force you to become a priest. If you go to seminary and discern, this isn't for me, you're free to leave. What we care about in this diocese, above all else, is for you to become a saint, for you to grow in your relationship with Jesus Christ. And if that is by becoming a priest, if that's the best way for you to become a saint and to help other people become saints, we want to support that. But it's free. So if you go to seminary and through your time of prayer and spending time with other priests and doing ministry in the church, you discern that this is not where God's calling you, you are free to leave, to continue to abide in relationship with God so that you can perceive how God is now calling you to continue your walk toward eternity. These are just a few practical tips that we believe could be helpful for you as you process and discern and learn how God is inviting you to become a saint in your walk toward heaven.